The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the Boeotian plains, turning the air thick and wavering like the surface of a disturbed pond. Aristodemus pressed his calloused palm against the rough bark of an olive tree, feeling the ancient wood pulse with life beneath his fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a raven cawed, once, twice, 3 times. His grandmother would have called it an omen. 3 cries meant death was coming, she used to say, her weathered hands weaving wool as she spoke. Death for someone close. He didn't believe in omens anymore. Not since Thermopylae. The name alone made his chest tighten, made his breathing shallow and quick. 2 years had passed since that narrow pass, since 300 Spartans and their king had held the Persian horde for 3 impossible days. 2 years since Aristodemus had walked away alive while better men fell. The official story called him a survivor. His fellow Spartans called him something else. Aristodemus the Trembler, the coward who lived. Now he stood on the edge of another battlefield, watching the largest army the world had ever seen spread across the valley like a plague of locusts. 70,000 men, maybe more. Persians, Medes, Bactrians, Indians, soldiers from every corner of King Xerxes' vast empire, their armor glinting like stars fallen to earth. They had burned Athens to ash, they had turned the Aegean Sea red with Greek blood, and now they had come to Boeotia to finish what they started. Against them, 38,000 Greeks, farmers and potters and merchants who had picked up spears because their cities had no one else to send. Oh, there were professional warriors too, Spartans in their crimson cloaks, Tegeans with their bronze-faced shields, Athenians who fought with the fury of men with nothing left to lose. But 38,000 against 70, those weren't odds. That was arithmetic announcing your funeral. Aristodemus felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find Pausanias, the Spartan regent and commander of all Greek forces, studying him with those unsettling gray eyes that seemed to see through armor and flesh straight into a man's core. "You're thinking too much again," Pausanias said quietly. His voice carried the strange musical quality of someone who had been educated by poets and trained by killers. At 26, he was younger than Aristodemus by 3 years, yet he commanded 10,000 men with the casual authority of someone born to rule, which of course he was, nephew to Leonidas, the king who died at Thermopylae, the king Aristodemus had failed. "I'm counting," Aristodemus replied, gesturing toward the Persian camp. Even from this distance, nearly a mile away, the enemy host looked infinite. Their pavilions stretched to the horizon, silk and canvas in every color imaginable, crimson and gold, azure and emerald, purple reserved for the Persian nobility. Cooking fires sent up 100 columns of smoke. The sound of 70,000 men, talking, laughing, sharpening blades, feeding horses, created a low hum that vibrated in Aristodemus's bones. "And what do your numbers tell you?" Pausanias asked. There was no mockery in the question, only genuine curiosity. It was one reason why Aristodemus had followed him here despite everything, despite the whispers that still trailed him through Spartan streets like hungry dogs. "They tell me we should be running." Pausanias laughed, a short, sharp bark of genuine amusement. "Now there's the honest assessment our Council of Generals refuses to give me. They stand around my tent making speeches about Greek valor and how the gods favor the righteous, as if Zeus gives a damn about battlefield arithmetic." He turned to face the Persian army fully, his scarred hands resting on the pommel of his Xiphos sword. "But we're not running, are we?" "No, sir." "Do you know why?" Aristodemus had heard all the official reasons: Greek freedom, defense of homeland, the preservation of democracy and philosophy, and all those beautiful words that sounded noble when spoken by men safely behind city walls. But standing here, smelling the dust and horse dung and fierce sweat of the gathered armies, those words felt hollow. "Because there's nowhere left to run," he finally said. "They've taken everything else." "Exactly." Pausanias' voice dropped lower now, intimate, only meant for Aristodemus.
2 years ago at Thermopylae, Leonidas bought us time with blood. Time for Athens to evacuate. Time for the Greek cities to rally. Time for this desperate, probably doomed alliance of rivals who hate each other almost as much as they hate the Persians. He paused, jaw working as if chewing on words too bitter to swallow. My uncle didn't die so we could spend those 2 years running. He died so we could choose where to make our stand. A horn sounded from the Persian lines, a long, mournful note that set dogs barking throughout the Greek camp. Aristodemus watched as a section of the enemy army began to move, cavalry mostly, at least 2,000 strong. They weren't attacking, just positioning, but the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath those thousands of hoofs. "They're testing us," Pausanias observed. "Mardonius wants to see how we react to movement, whether we're disciplined or whether we'll break formation and scatter like the amateur army we appear to be." Mardonius, the name tasted like copper in Aristodemus's mouth, the Persian general who destroyed Athens, who commanded Xerxes' forces in Greece after the god-king himself had retreated east following the naval disaster at Salamis. Mardonius the Brilliant, they called him, Mardonius the Merciless. A man who conquered nations before he turned 30, who'd never lost a battle, who moved armies like a chess master moved pieces on a board. "Pass the word," Pausanias said, voice rising to command volume now. "No one moves, no one reacts. We stand exactly where we are until I give explicit orders otherwise." Aristodemus nodded and moved to relay the command, but Pausanias caught his arm. "And Aristodemus, tonight, when the sun sets and men start talking around their fires, when the fear gets loud and spreads like plague, I need you to walk among them." "Sir, they don't listen to me. I'm not the right person for—" "You're exactly the right person." Pausanias' grip tightened, not painful, but insistent. "Do you know what most of these men fear more than death? They fear dying meaninglessly. They fear their deaths accomplishing nothing. You were at Thermopylae. You saw 300 men hold the world's largest army for 3 days. You witnessed the impossible. When you tell them that ordinary men can defeat Persia's finest, they'll believe you because you were there." "I was the one who lived," Aristodemus said quietly, "while better men died." "Yes, which means you're the one who can tell the story." Pausanias released him, turning back toward the Persian lines. "War isn't just about courage, Aristodemus. It's about belief. Make them believe, and we might actually survive tomorrow." As Aristodemus moved through the Greek camp that evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, he realized that Pausanias had understood something crucial. These men, these Greeks from 100 different cities, with 100 different dialects and gods and grievances, they needed more than tactical commands. They needed a reason to stand their ground when every instinct screamed at them to run. He found a group of Tegeans sharpening spears around a small fire, their faces young and scared despite their best attempts to hide it. One couldn't have been more than 17, smooth-cheeked and wide-eyed. When Aristodemus approached, they fell silent, recognizing the lambda symbol on his shield that marked him as Spartan. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. They made room wordlessly, as Greeks always did for Spartans. That deference used to fill him with pride. Now it just made him tired. "You were at Thermopylae," the young one said. Not a question. "I was." "What was it like?" Another soldier, older, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. Truly, not the version the poets sing. What was it actually like?
Aristodemus closed his eyes, and for a moment he was back there. He could smell the sea salt and blood, could hear the clash of bronze on bronze, could feel the shoulder of the man beside him pressed against his own in the phalanx formation, that intimate press of shields and bodies that meant life or death. In the phalanx, you lived because the man to your right protected your exposed side with his shield. You lived because the man to your left trusted you to do the same. You lived because 30, 50, 100 men became a single organism, a bronze-scaled beast with 300 swords for claws.
It was terrifying, he said finally, opening his eyes. Every moment. The Persians came in waves, and each wave was fresh while we got more and more exhausted. They had cavalry that could ride around our flanks if we broke formation even once. They had archers who could turn the sky black with arrows. They had everything. "But you won," the young soldier insisted. "For 3 days you held them." "We held them because of the pass," Aristodemus explained. At Thermopylae, the pass was so narrow that the Persians couldn't use their numbers. They had to come at us in a front maybe 50 men wide. In that space, their 70,000 was worth no more than our 300. He paused, letting them digest this. "But tomorrow, we fight on open ground. They'll come at us from every direction. Their cavalry will try to flank us. Their archers will rain death from above. Everything that made Thermopylae defensible, we won't have it tomorrow." He watched despair flicker across their faces like shadows from the fire, and felt a strange satisfaction in his honesty. Let them know what they faced. Let them make their peace with it. "So why are you still here?" the scarred soldier asked. "If you know we're going to lose, why not desert? Why not run south and hope Persia never finds you?" It was a fair question. Aristodemus had asked himself the same thing 1,000 times during the march north. He could have stayed in Sparta, could have accepted his shame and lived out his days in disgrace. At least he would have lived. Instead, he had volunteered for this, had begged Pausanias to let him join the expedition. Why? "Because of something I realized at Thermopylae," he said slowly, working through the thought even as he spoke it. "The Persians are better equipped than us, better trained, better fed. They have more men, more resources, more of everything. By every measure that matters, they should have walked through that pass like it wasn't even there. But they didn't. For 3 days they couldn't, not because we were stronger, but because we were together." He pointed to the young soldier's spear, its point freshly sharpened and gleaming in the firelight. "That weapon is nothing special. You're not the greatest warrior who ever lived. Neither am I. Neither was King Leonidas, gods rest him. But put us in formation, lock our shields together, trust the man beside us to hold his ground, and suddenly we become something greater than the sum of our parts. We become unbreakable." "Until someone breaks," the young soldier whispered. "Yes," Aristodemus agreed, "until someone breaks. That's why we drill. That's why Spartans spend their entire lives training for war, not to make us individually stronger, but to make us constitutionally incapable of breaking that line. Because if one man runs, the whole formation collapses. If one shield drops, every man in the phalanx dies." He stood, stretching muscles already sore from the day's march. "Tomorrow, when you're standing in that line, and the Persians are charging, and every fiber of your being is screaming at you to run, remember this. The man to your right is just as scared as you are. So is the man to your left. They want to run too. But if all of you hold, if all of you trust each other to stand firm, then the Persians can throw their entire army at us, and we won't break. That's what happened at Thermopylae. That's what's going to happen tomorrow." "You really believe that?" the scarred soldier asked. Aristodemus thought about lying, about giving them the certainty they wanted, but these men deserved the truth. "I believe it's possible," he said slowly. "I believe that if we do everything right, if we maintain discipline and formation, if we trust each other completely, then we have a chance. Maybe not a good chance, but a chance." He moved on to the next fire, then the next, repeating variations of the same message to Athenians and Corinthians, to Mycenaeans and Phlicians, to the small contingents from island cities who had sailed across dangerous waters to be here. And gradually, as the night deepened and the stars emerged like distant campfires in the sky's dark field, he felt something shift in the camp. Not confidence exactly, but something harder, more durable. Resignation, perhaps, or acceptance. The knowledge that tomorrow they would stand together or die together, and there was a strange comfort in that certainty. Near midnight, Aristodemus found himself at the Athenian section of the camp, where the fires burned brighter and the men talked louder, still raw with anger over their city's destruction. An Athenian hoplite named Amenius recognized him. They had fought together briefly during the chaotic naval battle at Salamis the previous year to be here. "The Spartans sent their pet coward to inspire us?" Amenius called out, but there was no real heat in it, just bitter humor, men used to hold fear at bay. "Just making my rounds," Aristodemus replied evenly. He had learned long ago not to rise to such provocations. What could he say that would change their minds? What defense could he offer that wouldn't sound like excuses? "Sit," Amenius said, gesturing to a spot near the fire. "I don't actually care about your reputation. Any man who volunteers for this suicide mission can't be a complete coward." Aristodemus sat, accepting a wineskin that was passed to him. The wine was watered down. Pausanias had issued strict orders about staying sober, but it still burned pleasantly in his throat. "I've been thinking about your city," Aristodemus said after a long silence. "Athens." "Don't," Amenius said sharply. "Don't you dare offer me sympathy or prayers or any of that shit. Athens is gone. The temples are rubble. The agora where Socrates taught, is ashes. My home, my wife's workshop, the olive tree my grandfather planted, all of it burned." His voice cracked slightly. "So don't you dare," Aristodemus interrupted. "I was going to say that Mardonius made a mistake, burning Athens. He thought he was breaking your spirit, destroying your will to fight, but all he did was make you angry." "Huh, we're angry. We're furious. We want to shove our spears so far down Persian throats they come out the other side. But anger doesn't win battles." "It can, if you channel it correctly. The Persians, they're fighting because Xerxes ordered them to, because generals and satraps told them to march west. But you're fighting for something real, for revenge, for the possibility that maybe someday Athens can be rebuilt. That's worth more than all of Persia's gold." "Pretty words," Amenius said, "but tomorrow when their cavalry is running us down and their archers are blotting out the sun, will pretty words keep us alive?" "No," Aristodemus admitted, "but they might keep you standing long enough to kill the men trying to kill you, and if enough of us do that, then maybe." A horn blast cut through the night, different from the Persian horns they had heard earlier. This was Greek, the signal for all commanders to report to Pausanias' tent immediately. Aristodemus stood, his heart suddenly hammering. A midnight council could only mean one thing. Something had changed. The command tent was already crowded when Aristodemus arrived. Pausanias stood over a rough map sketched in dirt on the tent floor, while commanders from every Greek city argued in dozens of different dialects. The air was thick with tension and the smell of unwashed men. "Complete madness. We should fall back to the isthmus." "And let them burn every city between here and Corinth? Absolutely not. It doesn't matter what we want. Our supply lines are compromised." "Silence!" Pausanias' voice cracked like a whip. The tent fell quiet. "Aristides, you brought the news. Report."
Aristides the Just, the Athenian general, stepped forward. Despite his noble nickname, he looked haggard, his armor stained with mud and worse. "Our scouts report Persian cavalry movements along our western flank. They're positioning to cut off our water supply from the Asopus River. Without access to that river, we'll die of thirst before we ever have to fight them." "So we move," said Euryanax, commander of the Tegean forces. "Reposition to protect our supply line." "Moving at night, in this darkness? We'd lose cohesion before we marched 100 paces, argued a Corinthian officer whose name Aristodemus didn't know. "We'd arrive at our new position scattered and disorganized, perfect targets for Persian archers at dawn." "Then we stay and fight for the river at first light," Amenius proposed. "That's exactly what Mardonius wants," Pausanias said quietly. Everyone turned to him. "He's trying to force us into a disadvantageous engagement. If we fight for the river, we'll be spread out, defending a long line. He can concentrate his forces and break us piece by piece." "Then what do you propose?" Aristides asked, "because doing nothing means we'd die of thirst, and moving means we'd die disorganized, and fighting means we'd die piecemeal. I'm not seeing a lot of options that don't end with us dying." Pausanias stared at the dirt map for a long moment. Then he reached down and swept his hand across it, erasing everything. "We make Mardonius come to us, on ground of our choosing." He began to sketch a new formation with a stick. "There's high ground half a mile south of here near the ruins of a Demeter temple. If we can reach it, we'll have the advantage of elevation. Mardonius will have to attack uphill." "You just said we can't move at night without losing cohesion," the Corinthian officer objected. "We can if we move in shifts," Pausanias replied. "The Spartans and Tegeans will hold position here, making noise, keeping fires burning, maintaining the appearance of a full camp. Meanwhile, the rest of the army moves in companies, quietly, guided by men who know this terrain. By dawn, most of our forces will be in position on the high ground. Then the Spartans withdraw, fighting a rearguard action if necessary." "You're asking us to abandon the Spartans," Aristides said slowly, "to leave them holding the line while we retreat." "I'm asking you to trust that Spartans know how to fight outnumbered," Pausanias replied. "We've had some practice." There was dark humor in that, and several men laughed nervously. Aristodemus felt his stomach tighten, a rearguard action against 70,000 Persians. It was the kind of mission that sounded glorious in songs and got everyone killed in reality. "I'll need volunteers," Pausanias continued, "Spartans and Tegeans to hold this position until dawn, men who can maintain discipline under pressure and withdraw in good order when the time comes." Every Spartan in the tent stepped forward immediately. It was instinct, drilled into them since childhood. When your commander called for volunteers for the dangerous mission, you volunteered. No hesitation, no calculation of odds. You stepped forward because that's what Spartans did. "Good," Pausanias said, as if he had expected nothing less. "We move in 2 hours. Get your men ready, and someone find me a scout who actually knows the path to that temple in the dark, because I'll be damned if we march blind." The tent emptied quickly as commanders rushed to their units. Aristodemus lingered, watching Pausanias study the crude map he had drawn. "You know this is insane," Aristodemus said quietly when they were alone. "I know. You think Mardonius could attack at dawn, catch us mid-movement, slaughter us while we're scattered?" "He could. Or he could ignore the high ground entirely, march south around us, and we'll have abandoned a decent defensive position for nothing." "Also possible." Pausanias looked up, and there was something ancient in his young eyes that made Aristodemus think of his uncle Leonidas. "But here's what I know about Mardonius. He's brilliant. He's methodical. He's conquered half the world by being patient and letting his enemies make mistakes, which means he's going to take tonight to confirm that we're actually moving, to scout our new position, to plan his attack carefully. He won't rush. Why would he? He has us outnumbered 2-1. Time is on his side. Unless he realizes we're gaining a significant advantage by taking the high ground. By the time he realizes that, we'll already be dug in." Pausanias rolled up the map. "Look, I'm not going to lie to you, Aristodemus. This is desperate. We're one bad decision away from complete annihilation. But that's been true since the moment we decided to face them in open battle. At least this gives us a chance." "And if it doesn't work? If we scatter in the dark and dawn finds us helpless?" "Then we die," Pausanias said simply. "But we were always going to die. This way we die trying something instead of just waiting for the end." The movement began 2 hours later, exactly as planned. The Athenians went first, their officers hissing orders for silence as 10,000 men tried to move like ghosts through the darkness. Then the Corinthians, then the Mycenaeans, then the island contingents. Aristodemus watched them go from his position with the Spartan rearguard, seeing how they stumbled over unseen rocks, how they bunched up and spread out, how discipline frayed in the absence of visible leadership. This was the gamble. In daylight, in formation, these men were a fighting force. In darkness, moving through unfamiliar terrain, they were just scared men trying to not get lost. If Mardonius attacked now— But no attack came. The Persian camp remained quiet, their fires burning bright, their sentries apparently unaware that half the Greek army was currently sneaking away like thieves in the night. Or maybe they knew and didn't care. Maybe Mardonius was happy to let the Greeks exhaust themselves with a night march, figuring they'd be easier to kill come morning. "They're going to notice soon," Amamafaratus said, the Spartan commander of the Prytanate regiment. He was a big man, scarred and gray-haired, with the kind of face that looked permanently angry. "When they realize 2/3 of our army vanished in the night, they're going to come at us hard." "Then we'd better be ready to move," Pausanias replied. "Move? Run, you mean?" Amamafaratus spat. "Spartans don't run." "Spartans follow orders," Pausanias said coldly. "And when I give the command to withdraw, you will execute it. I will not flee before barbarians." The argument might have escalated, but a horn blast from the Persian camp cut it short. Aristodemus turned to see the enemy army coming to life like a vast beast waking from a slumber. Standards rose, officers shouted, and slowly, with the terrible inevitability of sunrise, 70,000 men began to form up for battle. "They've noticed," Aristides said, unnecessarily.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Through the morning haze, Aristodemus could make out the Persian command group, a cluster of horsemen beneath a massive banner of purple and gold. Mardonius himself, no doubt, surrounded by his generals and personal guard. Even from this distance, Aristodemus could imagine what they were saying. "The Greeks are running. They're breaking. This is our moment." "Time to go," Pausanias announced. "Tegeans, move first. Spartans will maintain formation and follow. Keep your spacing, keep your discipline. If they charge before we reach the high ground, we form up and hold them off until the rest of the army can support us." The withdrawal began smoothly. Too smoothly. Aristodemus had been in enough fights to know that when things seemed to be working perfectly, disaster was usually just around the corner. The Tegeans moved at a quick march, not quite running, but moving as fast as discipline allowed. The Spartans followed, their shields locked together in the phalanx formation even as they moved, a mobile bronze wall that glittered in the rising sun. And then, just as Aristodemus had feared, everything went wrong. The Persian cavalry came first, not the entire force, just a probing attack, maybe 500 horsemen thundering across the plain in a cloud of dust. They weren't trying to break the Spartan formation, not yet. They were just harassing, testing, looking for weakness. Arrows fell like deadly rain, and Aristodemus raised his shield to cover not just himself, but the man beside him, feeling the impacts shudder through bronze and wood. "Hold formation," Pausanias bellowed. "Keep moving." But Amamfaratus, that stubborn bastard, had decided this was the moment to make his stand. Instead of continuing the withdrawal, his entire regiment stopped and turned to face the Persian cavalry. "What is he doing?" Aristodemus shouted. "Being a God's-damned hero," Pausanias snarled. "Aristodemus, take 50 men and convince Amamfaratus that dying pointlessly for pride isn't actually heroic." Aristodemus didn't wait for clarification. He grabbed the nearest men and ran toward Amampharatus' position, where the Penitate regiment had formed a defensive square and were preparing to receive the Persian charge. "Amampharatus!" Aristodemus shouted when he reached the gray-haired commander. "Pausanias orders you to withdraw!" "Spartans don't run from barbarians," Amampharatus repeated, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had made peace with dying. "This isn't running, you magnificent idiot. This is tactics. We're drawing them toward the high ground where—" The Persian cavalry hit them like a bronze-tipped wave. Aristodemus barely got his shield up in time, feeling the impact of a horse's shoulder shudder through his entire body. A spear thrust appeared from nowhere, and he deflected it by pure instinct, his own xiphos flashing out to open the Persian rider's thigh. The man screamed and wheeled away, blood streaming. Then the cavalry was past, circling for another run, and Aristodemus realized they had maybe 60 seconds before the next charge. "Listen to me," he said urgently to Amampharatus. "Every moment we stand here is a moment the rest of the army has to reach position. You want to die for Sparta? Fine, but die doing something useful. Hold them off for 5 more minutes, then withdraw.
That's how we win, not by standing in one place until we're overwhelmed, but by making them chase us into a trap. Something in his words must have penetrated Amompharetus's thick skull, because the old commander finally nodded. 5 minutes, then we move. Those 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. The Persian cavalry came again and again, each charge a hammer blow against the Spartan shield wall. Aristodemus lost track of how many times he thrust his spear between bronze rims, how many Persian horses he turned aside with his shield, how many times death passed within inches of his face. The world contracted to the press of bodies around him, the smell of blood and horse sweat, the clang of bronze on bronze that made his ears ring. And then, just as Aristodemus had feared, the cavalry withdrew. Not defeated, they had barely been dented, but simply pulling back to regroup. And in that brief respite, Amompharetus finally gave the order to withdraw. They ran. There was no shame in admitting it. They kept formation as best they could, but they ran, shields on backs, weapons ready, constantly glancing over shoulders to see if the Persians were pursuing. Behind them, the full Persian army was now advancing, a massive wall of men and horses that seemed to cover the entire horizon. "They're committing everything," Pausanias observed as they ran. He wasn't even breathing hard, the bastard. "Mardonius sees us fleeing and thinks he has us beaten. He's going to hit us with everything he has." "Is that good or bad?" Aristodemus gasped out between breaths. "Both." Pausanias pointed ahead, where the ruins of the Demeter temple crowned a low rise. "If we reach that ground before they catch us, we'll have the advantage. But if they catch us in the open, scattered and disorganized, 70,000 Persians will roll over us like a wave on sand." The high ground seemed impossibly far away. Aristodemus's legs burned, his lungs screamed. The weight of bronze armor and shield felt like it might drag him into the earth. Around him, other men were flagging, stumbling, falling behind. This is how armies broke, not through grand defeats, but through exhaustion and fear and the simple human inability to keep running when every muscle was on fire. And then Persian arrows began to fall. Not scattered shots from cavalry, but organized volleys from massed archers, thousands of arrows that turned the sky dark. The Spartans raised shields overhead, forming the testudo, the tortoise formation that offered maximum protection from aerial assault. But you couldn't run in testudo. You could only shuffle forward slowly, while arrows hammered down like deadly hail. Men fell. Aristodemus heard them crying out, heard the wet thunk of arrowheads finding flesh between armor plates, heard the screams of men who knew they were dying but weren't dead yet. The man to his right took an arrow through his calf and went down hard. Aristodemus wanted to stop, wanted to help, but couldn't. If he stopped, everyone behind him would stop, and then they would all die together. So he kept moving, one step, another. The high ground was closer now, close enough that he could see other Greeks already in position, forming battle lines, waiting. The Athenians were there, the Corinthians. All the men who had moved during the night were now dug in on advantageous terrain, and all Aristodemus had to do was reach them. 100 yards, 50, 20, and then he was there, gasping, stumbling into the Greek lines as hands reached out to steady him. He turned to count who had made it, saw Pausanias arriving with the last of the Spartans, saw Amompharetus bloodied but alive. They had made it. Against all odds, they had actually made it. "Form up!" commanders were shouting. "Shield wall! Spears ready!" Because the Persians were coming, not pursuing anymore, but attacking, their entire army surging up the slope toward the Greek position in a tide of bronze and steel and fury that seemed unstoppable. This was it. This was the moment everything had been building towards. The Persians outnumbered them, outflanked them, had better weapons and armor and cavalry and archers. But the Greeks had the high ground. They had discipline, and they had desperation. Aristodemus found his place in the Spartan line, shoulder to shoulder with men who had trained their entire lives for this moment. To his right stood Pausanias, sword drawn, face calm despite everything. To his left, a young Spartan named Callicrates, who was widely considered the most beautiful man in Greece, something that seemed impossibly trivial right now as they watched death charge toward them up the hill.
"Remember," Pausanias called out, his voice carrying somehow over the thunder of approaching feet, "they have to come to us. They have to run uphill. They'll be tired when they reach us. We'll be fresh. Use that." The Persian front line hit them like a bronze-tipped wave crashing against rocks. Aristodemus felt the impact shudder through his entire body, felt his feet slide backward in the dirt before he caught himself and pushed forward. His spear found a Persian gut, withdrew, thrust again. Beside him, Callicrates was fighting with the fluid grace that had made him famous, his movements almost too beautiful to watch. On his other side, Pausanias fought with brutal efficiency, each movement economical, nothing wasted. The shield wall held. That was the miracle. Despite everything, despite the overwhelming numbers and the Persian fury and the arrows that still fell from above, the shield wall held. Because every man knew that the moment it broke, they were all dead. So they held, because there was no alternative. The battle became a grinding, brutal thing. No grand maneuvers, no clever tactics, just men pushing against each other, stabbing between shields, trying to kill before being killed. Aristodemus's world contracted to the few feet immediately around him. The face of the Persian he was fighting, young, scared, dying as Aristodemus's spear found his throat. The weight of the man behind him pushing forward, giving him the leverage to hold his ground. The constant rhythmic motion of thrust, withdraw, defend, repeat. Time lost meaning. Minutes or hours could have passed. All that mattered was the next thrust, the next defense, staying alive for one more heartbeat. And then something changed. Aristodemus felt it before he understood it. A shift in pressure, a wavering in the Persian assault. The men pushing against the shield wall weren't pushing as hard anymore. They were hesitating, looking back over their shoulders at something. "They're breaking!" someone shouted, and Aristodemus risked a glance past the immediate threat to see that it was true. The Persian flanks were starting to peel away, not in organized retreat, but in something approaching panic. What had happened? Had reinforcements arrived? Had the gods themselves intervened? "Forward!" Pausanias bellowed. "Push them back! Don't let them reform!" The Greeks surged down the hill, and suddenly the battle transformed from desperate defense to violent rout. The Persians were running now, their discipline shattered, and the Greeks pursued with all the fury of men who had been pushed to the very edge of death and found themselves somehow still alive. Aristodemus ran with them, caught up in the momentum, his spear finding backs and legs and any exposed flesh. Around him, men were screaming, victory cries mixing with death screams in a cacophony that seemed to shake the heavens. The Persian camp was ahead, those beautiful silk pavilions and supply wagons, and the Greeks fell on it like wolves on wounded deer. It wasn't until the sun was high overhead and the battle had devolved into scattered fighting that Aristodemus learned what had turned the tide. The Athenians, positioned on the Greek left, had broken the Persian line there and swept around to attack Mardonius's command position. In the fighting, Mardonius himself had fallen, the brilliant general who had never lost a battle, killed by an Athenian javelin. With their commander dead and the battle turning against them, the Persian army had simply collapsed. 70,000 men defeated by 38,000. An impossible victory built on discipline and desperation and a dozen tactical decisions that had somehow all worked out. As night fell and the Greeks counted their dead and their plunder, Aristodemus found himself back near what remained of the Persian command tent. Someone had retrieved Mardonius's body and laid it out with military honors. Even enemies deserved respect in death. The Persian general looked smaller dead than he had seemed alive, his face peaceful despite the massive wound in his chest. "Thinking about what could have been?" Pausanias asked, peering beside him. "Thinking about how close we came.
If they had attacked during our night march, if Amapharatus had gotten us all killed with his stubbornness, if the Athenians hadn't broken through on the left, a dozen moments where everything could have gone differently. "That's war," Pausanias said. "It's not about being stronger or braver. It's about making fewer mistakes than your enemy and getting luckier when mistakes happen." He paused, looking out over the battlefield where fires were being lit and the living were trying to separate themselves from the dead. "You did well today. When Amapharatus decided to be a hero, you stopped him from getting everyone killed. That took courage." "I was terrified the entire time." "Good. Smart people are terrified in battle. It's the idiots who think they're invincible who get killed." Pausanias clapped him on the shoulder. "The council is meeting at dawn to discuss terms with the Persian survivors and coordinate our next moves. I want you there." "Sir, I'm not—" "You're not what? Not worthy? Not experienced enough?" Pausanias turned to face him fully. "Aristodemus, you survived Thermopylae and Plataea. You've seen victory and defeat, courage and cowardice. You've made mistakes and learned from them. That makes you exactly the kind of person I need advising me going forward." He softened slightly. "And for what it's worth, I don't care what they called you in Sparta. You're no coward. You're just a man who survived when others didn't. There's no shame in that." Long after Pausanias had left, Aristodemus remained standing among the ruins of the Persian camp, watching dawn approach. Behind him, the Greek army was celebrating, singing songs that would become legends, beginning the transformation of today's messy, chaotic, terrifying battle into tomorrow's glorious epic. But Aristodemus wasn't thinking about glory. He was thinking about the young Tegean soldier from last night, the one with the smooth face and wide eyes, wondering if he had survived. He was thinking about all the men who had stood in that shield wall, who had held when every instinct screamed at them to run, who had trusted the man beside them with their lives and had that trust repaid. That was what had won this battle. Not tactics or terrain or divine intervention, just men choosing again and again in every moment of terror to stand together, to hold the line, to trust. The sun rose over Plataea, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and Aristodemus the Trembler, who would forever after be known as Aristodemus the Avenger, finally allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he had done enough, that his survival at Thermopylae wasn't cowardice, but preparation for this moment, that every man who died bought time for this victory. In the distance, Greek commanders were already arguing about credit and glory, about who had fought hardest, about which city deserved the most honor. It was exhausting and petty and completely predictable. These men who had just stood together against the largest empire the world had ever seen would spend the next decades bickering and occasionally fighting each other. That was the Greek way. But for one shining moment at Plataea, they had been united. They had looked at impossible odds and laughed. They had taken everything Persia could throw at them and held their ground. And they had won. Not because they were stronger or braver or favored by gods, but because when the moment came, when terror and exhaustion and every rational calculation said to run, they chose to stand together instead. That was the story Aristodemus would carry forward. Not tales of individual heroism or divine intervention, but the simple truth that ordinary men, properly united, could accomplish the impossible. It wasn't a story that would make poets wealthy or get sung at symposiums, but it was true. And in the end, truth mattered more than glory. As the sun climbed higher and the work of counting the dead began in earnest, Aristodemus turned his back on the battlefield and walked toward the future, toward whatever came next for Greece, now that they had proven that even empires could fall. Behind him, the smoke of 10,000 fires rose into the morning sky, carrying prayers and victory songs up to gods who had watched men redefine what was possible. The Battle of Plataea was over. The story of what that victory meant for Greece, for freedom, for the very idea that small nations could resist empires was just beginning. And Aristodemus, who had survived when better men died, who had been called coward and proven himself brave, who had stood at Thermopylae and Plataea and lived to tell both tales, would spend the rest of his life trying to explain to anyone who would listen that the real miracle wasn't the victory itself. It was that men found the courage to believe victory was possible. That alone changed everything.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.